is to provide a review of the motor systems by comparing and contrasting the signs and symptoms you see in patients that have damage to different parts of the subsystems involved. We're going to try to focus a little bit more on Parkinson's disease because it's the second most common neurological disease in the United States. And so I'm sure many people in the audience are interested in learning about it. Now, our presentation of the clinical disorders is by necessity going to be greatly simplified, and it should be understood that each of the disorders is much more complex than we're going to present here. Nonetheless, I think it's very important that you realize that the information that you've already gained in this class, what you already know, actually is going to help you understand why patients with different types of lesions show the signs and symptoms that they do. So let's review again. The motor system, you have your pyramidal, which is direct and indirect cortical spinal pathways. And again, these are going to be involved, the only system that goes to the spinal cord to actually initiate and cause any kind of movement to happen. An extrapyramidal system, which is involved in many things like motor programs and also maintaining your ability to do certain kinds of movements. And lastly, your cerebellum, and that is going to be the structure which is primarily going to coordinate learned skilled motor movement. Now, what we want to do is to go into a little bit more detail about some of these systems and then look at what happens in patients. So if we look at our pyramidal pathway, which we've seen many times since the beginning of this course, we have our motor neuron, our little pyramidal cells, up in motor cortex, projecting their axons down through the brainstem, and here projecting collaterals off to other areas that are involved in the motor system. So all these other areas know what motor movement is going to be initiated by the motor cortex. But ultimately, this is the cortical spinal pathway. It's going to project two anterior horn cells that are down in the spinal cord. And then those anterior horn cells are going to go out to the muscle. Now, what you're going to have when you have injury to the system is you're going to have paralysis to some part of the body. And we see our little lady figure here, half of my body represented in motor cortex. And depending on what axons are damaged or what neurons are damaged, you'll see a loss of function in a particular part of the body. We already saw this when we looked at stroke, because you remember, the anterior cerebral artery supplies the medial aspect of motor cortex, and that means when you have a stroke, thereby compromising the blood supply to neurons that represent this part of the body, then you have a contralateral paralysis of the lower limb. So this is very important to appreciate, that the body map is what would determine in this pyramidal system if the disorder involved the cortex. Now, actually, let's add some information to this. If an individual actually had such damage, they don't just have paralysis, they have a specific type of paralysis. And that paralysis is called spastic paralysis. So it means they can't initiate a motor movement. That's what paralysis means. But if the doctor checks the individual, what they will show is that they will show increased reflexes. You know how the doctor taps your tendon in your knee to see a reflex? Your reflexes will be increased and your muscle tone will be increased. So let's just think about it. I can lead you to this conclusion. The reason you have the increased reflexes and muscle tone is because, remember, damage to this system is also going to hit the indirect cortical spinal pathways. And what were they involved in? They're involved in keeping that background tone appropriate. So if you lesion this system, you get paralysis, plus the addition of abnormal tone and reflexes. Now, the other thing is important to understand, so let's just think about this. We talked about it once before, but I want to make sure that everyone understands this. The motor cortex on this side controls the contralateral half of the body. We certainly, at this point, understand that fully. But notice that where along the pathway matters as to whether or not your signs and symptoms with damage are going to be contra or ipsi. So let's go through the pathway again. These neurons in area 4 are going to travel down through the brain and in the lower medulla cross to enter the spinal cord. Then they're going to exit at an appropriate level. So if we damage these axons before they've crossed, our signs and symptoms are contralateral. You can always remember that, remembering that this half of the cortex controls that half of the body. After the axons have crossed, if we injure those axons after they've crossed, the signs and symptoms will be ipsilateral to the lesion. So they will be ipsilateral to the damage because the axons have already crossed. So that just adds a little bit about the knowledge that you have. Now, a different type of paralysis is actually going to occur if you injure the anterior horn cell. So what we've been talking about is spastic paralysis, which will occur if you injure anything along this cortical spinal pathway. And remember, axons of the indirect cortical spinal pathways run along with this. If you injure here, you get contralateral spastic paralysis. If you injure here, you get ipsilateral spastic paralysis. Now let's look at our anterior horn cells. The anterior horn cells go out to the muscle and actually cause the contraction. If you have a lesion that involves these anterior horn cells, and by the way, polio would be such a disorder. If you have a disorder that specifically involves these anterior horn cells or the axons, which lead from the cell body, what you will see in the patient is a flaccid paralysis. And flaccid paralysis refers to the fact that now movement can't be made because the individual can't cause contraction of the muscle, and that probably makes sense to you. But you have a decreased reflexes and decreased muscle tone. And this time, the reason for it is something that if you thought about it for a minute, you'd probably come to this conclusion. What is happening in this case is you've denervated the muscle. So you've denervated the muscle, so you get decreased reflexes. The muscle would have to be intact in every way in its nervous innervation for you to be able to have a normal reflex. And the muscle tone decreases. Over time, individuals who have disorders that affect these neurons, the anterior horn cells that go out to actually innervate the muscle, have a wasting of their muscle. The denervation actually causes changes in the muscle that's no longer innervated. And again, it depends on what level of the spinal cord's involved. So for example, if it was anterior horn cells in the lumbar region, it might be the muscles of the leg that would be wasted. So the muscle needs to have the innervation. It needs the innervation to be firm, to be toned, and to make a movement. Now, individuals who have spinal cord injury, for example, at very high cervical levels, they break their neck, like the actor Christopher Reeve. What you have is an entire paralysis. Quadriplegia means that all four limbs are involved. It's high cervical lesions that produce this, and the individual is essentially paralyzed from the neck down. If you were to test such a patient, what you see is that the patient will show spastic paralysis below the level of the lesion and flaccid paralysis at the level. That is one of the ways that doctors use when people have lesions only on one side, anywhere that involves the spinal cord. What they're doing is looking for the level where it changes to the flaccid paralysis, because at the level of the lesion, you're hitting the anterior horn cells that go out at that level, so you get flaccid paralysis. But you're cutting all the axons that are going farther down that are part of the cortical spinal tract, so below the level, you get spastic paralysis. And so this is what the doctor is testing each level to know where the lesion is at, where the damage to the spinal cord has taken place. Now, it's very important to point out, every once in a while, and someone like Christopher Reeve is an excellent example, individuals have function that seems to return. Well, this isn't because the spinal cord is regenerated. It isn't because they've generated new neurons. What it is that when the spinal cord is first injured, it goes through a shock phase. And later, some axons that were not damaged will be able to function much later. So that's a very important point. Now, an individual with such an injury, something else which is very important to point out, sometimes if we look at someone who's quadriplegic and we have an enormous amount of sympathy for what's happened to that individual, it isn't just motor systems that are involved. This individual's brain is now cut off from the spinal cord. That also means that all of the sensory information that should go up to the brain from the body no longer does that. And so the individual is basically cut off entirely from all of the information. And this is why it matters that their turn, for example, the issue of bed sores, they can't feel pain, they can't make a movement. And like the actor Christopher Reeve died from an infection of a bed sore, even though he had the very finest of care that money could buy. So they're very critical issues. They can't regulate their temperature any longer in their body. There are many other things that occur, not just a lack of movement. Another thing that we have learned in modern neuroscience, and this is something that doctors had made the observation early on, but they didn't really understand what it meant. And that is that individuals who are quadriplegics over a long period of time seem to undergo emotional changes. And these emotional changes were originally thought to simply be due to the terrible thing that had happened to them, so that they were depressed or whatever. And then physicians started noticing it wasn't really depression, that some of patients that are quadriplegic certainly are depressed, and no one would fault them for being so. But there were subtle changes in the person's personality. And now we know that a lot of our development of what we mean by a self comes from the feedback we get from our body and the feelings we get from our body. So that these individuals who can no longer get these feelings from their body actually do undergo changes in their personality and in the way they view themselves as individual human beings. It's obviously complicated by the fact that this terrible thing has happened, so their lives have been completely altered. But we now know that these ascending systems in the body play a critical role in our development of self. Now, there is another disorder that is going to affect the system which cortical spinal and those neurons in the spinal cord. And this is a disorder, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, probably better known in the United States as Lou Gehrig's disease, and in England as motor neuron disease. This is a disease which kills motor neurons everywhere in the brain and spinal cord at various times. So what you see in an individual with this disease, because both the cortical spinal tract and the anterior horn cells die over time. And so the individual slowly over time becomes completely paralyzed. And what is really terrible about this disease is that an individual with this disorder can live a long time and they are cognitively entirely intact. Their sensation is intact, every other system of their brain is intact, but they will slowly become paralyzed over time because of the loss of both the motor neurons in the cortex and motor neurons in their spinal cord. It is not uncommon to see in these patients, these neurons are degenerating at different rates and at different times. You will see spastic paralysis in a wasted limb. And so the most obvious example of someone who has this disorder, who is well known to the public, is Stephen Hawking. In addition, obviously, to Lou Gehrig, if you're a baseball fan. So Stephen Hawking actually has lived longer than any individual ever recorded with ALS. Now, this disease got its name for kind of an interesting reason that you should be able to appreciate when I tell you. When people long, long ago opened up the spinal cord of an individual who died of ALS, they noticed that the lateral portions of the spinal cord were hard. So let me tell you what that is. That's the sclerosis part. That means scar. The cortical spinal tracts had degenerated and it had been entirely replaced by astrocytic scars. And so the sides of the spinal cord were hard for that reason. That's the sclerosis, lateral sclerosis. Amyotrophic is because the physicians and pathologists noticed that the person's muscles were wasted, and they were wasted from the degeneration of the anterior horn cells that went out to various muscles. So essentially the person just slowly becomes paralyzed over time. Now, damage to the cerebellum, as we talked about in the last lecture, causes a completely different set of symptoms. And this is how physicians can tell whether you've had spinal cord injury or cerebellar injury when you're in a car accident, for example, or you fall off a motorcycle. So with the cerebellum, you have this intention tremor, the timing of movements is off, you can no longer coordinate your walking appropriately. There are other ways, but clearly this is entirely different than not being able to move. You can move, you simply can't coordinate it. And again, something like intention tremor is that the closer you get to something, the worse the tremor is as you try to make an intentional movement. And people suffer horribly from this because most of the movements human beings make are very fine movements. And so the closer they get to the end of the movement, the more you see, particularly in the distal limbs, you see that the person is unable to coordinate. What's important to just emphasize is that the person isn't paralyzed, they can move. So cortical spinal, direct and indirect, results in specific types of paralysis. And then you have cerebellar, loss of ability to coordinate. Now, so what occurs when there's damage to the extrapyramidal system? And we talked a little bit about this. Here's a huge number of nuclei complexly interconnected with each other. And we talked about, if you pluck one out of this complex system, then you have a different set of signs and symptoms than if you take another nuclear group out of the system. The other thing you need to remember about this, and this relates back to a previous lecture, and that is when you have any kind of complex system like that, remember my saying that there's this delicate balance of excitation and inhibition in the nervous system? Very strictly regulated excitation and inhibition. So what happens when you have damage to one of the nuclei in this extrapyramidal system and it's removed is you throw off the entire balance of excitation and inhibition, which ultimately involves motor movement. And so you can see a variety of disorders. We talked about a couple. We talked about damage to subthalamic that causes hemibolismus. Or you could take a particular neuron in certain structures out of the equation, and there you have Huntington's chorea. And now you have odd writhing movements of the limbs that the person can't control. So basically, it's really because you've thrown off excitation and inhibition in this complex circuit. So what I thought would be good for us to talk about next would be one disorder, which is the second most common neurological disease in the United States. And almost all of us know someone who suffers from this disease. And this disease is Parkinson's disease. So Parkinson's disease was named by James Parkinson, and he called it the shaking palsy. So this was called the shaking palsy original and now is named after him in honor of him. And Parkinson's disease or Parkinsonian signs and symptoms occur from the loss of one specific nuclear group, and that's those neurons named the black substance in the midbrain, the substantia nigra. It's due to the loss of just those neurons, and we'll talk in a minute about what happens. Now, I need to explain to you what the difference is between Parkinson's disease and Parkinsonian signs and symptoms. So in the medical community, if we know what is causing Parkinson's, we call those Parkinsonian signs and symptoms because there's a known insult. So for example, an individual who survives carbon monoxide poisoning develops Parkinsonian signs and symptoms. Parkinsonian signs and symptoms can be a side effect of a wide variety of medications that people take. So in this case, it's a known insult. We use the term Parkinson's disease to refer to an idiopathic reason, which means cause unknown. So the actual disease is given that name. In this class, I'm just going to call it Parkinson's disease so we get around some of these individual things. But you'll hear these terms, you wonder, are Parkinsonian signs and symptoms the same thing as Parkinson's disease or not? Well, you know, they are. So Parkinson's disease is the second most common neurological disorder in the United States. The signs and symptoms are due to the loss of the substantia nigra. Neurons in the substantia nigra, right here in our little midbrain, little tiny nucleus in the midbrain, use dopamine as a neurotransmitter. And those axons project forward to other neurons of this extrapyramidal system that were part of the basal ganglia, the caudate and putamen. So what happens in this disease is those substantia nigra neurons die, but that removes the dopaminergic input to the caudate and the putamen. And that's what really throws off this sort of balance of excitation and inhibition. So here's our little substantia nigra again. Here's our midbrain, and these are the neurons that die. They use dopamine, and they project forward to end their terminals or synapse in the caudate and the putamen. And when those neurons die, now the caudate and putamen are not getting their dopaminergic input. Now, wow, you know, one nuclear group dies and we have the second most common disease in the United States. So this is obviously of great importance to neuroscientists, and a lot has been learned about this. We know, for example, that one of the things that happens is, remember back to the lecture on neurotransmitters, I said that a neurotransmitter, what effect it has postsynaptically, depends on the specific type of postsynaptic receptor. So whether or not the membrane is depolarized or hyperpolarized is really due to the postsynaptic receptor. Well, it turns out that dopamine in this particular projection is both excitatory and inhibitory because it acts at two different dopaminergic receptor types in the caudate and putamen. This adds a level of complexity, but it's something that is very interesting in neuroscientists because directing pharmacological treatments will be directed at those two receptor types if we can develop drugs that will help individuals who have this disorder. Now, normally, the inhibitory pathway from the substantia nigra to particular receptors in caudate and putamen is going to act as a brake on the excitatory pathway. But now we've removed the dopaminergic input. And what's going to happen is that over time, the excitatory pathway is becoming very underactive, and the inhibitory pathway is becoming more active. And so that's just what happens as this balance of excitation and inhibition gets completely thrown off in this system. So, what happens when an individual has Parkinson's? What signs and symptoms would we see in this person? Well, we see a resting tremor, which is an involuntary movement at rest. I'm going to demonstrate that for you. The individual, when they walk, they have short shuffling steps, very characteristic of Parkinson's. And they have trouble getting movement going, and they have trouble stopping movement. So once they get going, they often run into things because they can't stop the movement appropriately. They have a stooped posture. They have a lack of normal movements, like swinging their arms when they walk. So when you walk normally, you swing your arms, and ultimately, they will freeze. So if I demonstrated some of this for you, for example, the tremor at rest, it's a very specific tremor. It means when you're not making a motor movement, you have the tremor. And it's almost like the thumb and the first finger are moving, so it's sometimes called a pill rolling tremor, like they had a pill in between there. So it's like this. And any part of the body can be involved. So you see people whose heads nod like this. Any part of the body can be involved, but it's generally the distal musculature. The individual takes short shuffling steps, and they have a stooped posture. So the individual will be stooped over like this, have the tremor, and they'll make short steps, and they have trouble getting going. So they lean way forward and almost, well, they can fall over actually, but they take little tiny short steps like this. And literally over time, the individual will freeze and be unable to make a movement. So as they walk, there's no swinging of the arms. There's none of that. Very characteristic view of a Parkinsonian patient. Now, this individual is sitting down like this. The individual, again, still be stooped. They'll still have the tremor, so they'll be doing this. And their face will lack expression because basically the motor control for normal movement, as we move and we speak, we have an animated face. Well, they lose that. They're freezing. They're losing normal movement. And if they went to get up from a chair, what we would do with normal caudate and putamen getting input from the substantia nigra is we'd do this, we'd lean forward to shift our body weight, our anti-gravity muscles would take over, and it would allow us to stand up. The Parkinsonian patient is like this, and here's the tremor, and they want to get up, but they don't make those normal movements that are automatic that you don't think about. And they'll rock forward, and suddenly they'll come out of the chair. And so obviously, individuals injure themselves a lot. It's extremely important that individuals who have this disorder be watched very carefully. Now, if you lose all of the neurons in the substantia nigra very quickly, and this actually happened in California, there was some heroin, synthetic heroin, that caused individuals who took that heroin to immediately become absolutely frozen. And actually, the movie Awakenings is about the flu pandemic in the First World War. A lot of men who were in Europe came back with encephalitis. And one of the diseases that they demonstrated later in life was advanced Parkinsonian signs and symptoms. And this is because the flu got into their brain and actually damaged their substantia nigra. So obviously, this is an extremely important disorder. Now, one last comment about this, because I think it's important. Individuals who have this will have a blank face, and they obviously don't talk a lot or interact, and this really changes their interaction with their loved ones. But most patients, not all, but most patients who have this disease are entirely normal cognitively. And so it's very painful for them because they're not able to make movement, and people now respond to them differently because they have this disorder and because they sit there with no facial expression and no movement. And so it's important to remember that most of the people who have this disease are still intact as people. So, how do we intervene in this disease? Well, there are three major ways that we intervene. The strategies involve either pharmacological treatment, trying to replace dopamine. Second, transplantation of dopamine-containing neurons so you can get dopamine in there. And last of all, implantation of electrodes to modify that excitation and inhibition in these circuits. So, let's start with the pharmacological treatment. This is, you're trying to replace dopamine. And the problem is dopamine doesn't pass what we call the blood-brain barrier very readily, so you have to give really high doses. And sadly, these drugs are very powerful, and they themselves can lead to abnormal motor movement. So you have a person who initially has Parkinson's, and then you give them a drug like Sinemet, and suddenly they start developing writhing movements. They move their head around like this, and this is a result of the medication, not of the disease, but of the medication. Now, we go to the next type of strategy. Transplantation of dopaminergic neurons. If you used embryonic cells from an aborted fetus, for example, and took out substantia nigra neurons or other neurons that use dopamine, or an adult person took part of the adrenal, which is a gland above your kidney, also uses catecholamines, which are norepinephrine and dopamine, you could actually stuff them in to the ventricle right here. So they would do brain surgery, put these cells in the ventricle, and those neurons will release dopamine. Remember where the substantia nigra projects? To the caudate and putamen. So these little neurons, particularly embryonic neurons, will actually grow axons into these structures and release dopamine. And so in countries like Sweden, and I think also in Mexico, they use embryonic cells and try to replace the dopamine that way. Now, the problem is that over time, these neurons die. So the individual is helped for some period of time, and these neurons shouldn't be there. It's nice we have a hole there that we can stick them in. I mean, it's very convenient. It's one of the reasons we've been able to do the surgery. But over time, the neurons die. So the last strategy, and this, in individuals in which this works, it is miraculous. They actually implant electrodes, which are just wires. They implant wires in other basal ganglia, nuclei, or in other structures of the extrapyramidal motor system. There are a number of different placements of the electrode. And what they do is they pass current down through those electrodes. And that affects the neurons in these different places where the electrodes are implanted. And if you do it in the right places, you can stop the seizures and everything, not seizures, you can stop the tremor right away. So the individual has electrodes implanted in their brain, and they have a lead that goes underneath the skin and goes down to a controller, which is underneath their skin in the chest. And they have a little unit that they can actually use to turn it on and off. So in my medical school class, I have people with such electrode implantations who come to my class and seem almost relatively normal. And then just for a second, we turn off the stimulation, and they'll have horrible tremors involving the whole body. And they wouldn't be able to turn it back on. I have to do it for them. And so this has just been absolutely miraculous. But nonetheless, both transplanted cells, that technique, and the placement of electrodes for this disorder involves brain surgery. So it is very, very serious. But this is where we're at this point in trying to treat the signs and symptoms. There is no cure. There is only management of the signs and symptoms. Thank you.